Okay, guys. So we'll probably start. So first of all, yeah, let me minimize this Zoom window. First of all, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy that conference is happening. And I'm happy that Zoom software can handle all of this these days. It probably handles enormous amount of traffic, so hats off to maintainers and developers of Zoom. So the title of this talk is How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love LSP and Emacs. And this is actually what describes my mood recently after I switched to LSP. And so the quick plan for today is to start from by the way, can you hear me well? Just to make sure.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay,
yes,
great.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So the quick plan for today, we'll start from kind of conceptual introductory things and going you through some of the basic what is LSP, just a quick overview and why it may matter to you. But what I would really like to concentrate on is usage side of things, setting things up. I will walk you through my configurations, what works for me, what doesn't work for me, and we'll share with you some useful tips and tricks which might be helpful for you. So why I want to share it with you, so this is going to be a story from somebody who is actually happy while using something else than IntelliJ IDEA for Scala development. But I would say it's even minor. And the bigger thing I want to share is that the problem of development environment can actually be solved once and for a long period of time by investing some of your effort and time into learning a few things and setting things up. So I actually like IntelliJ IDEA, and I really think that this is it's impossible to beat this software in terms of number of features, particularly for Scala development. But we will see that with a little bit of invest, we can actually build the environment that works not only for Scala, but for most of the major languages. To start, some statistics. This is based on my experience and what I see, what I hear from my colleagues and people who I work with. At least 50% of our time we spend on coding or reading the code. Probably we spend more time, or even more time, on reading the code. So obviously, it makes sense to invest time in optimizing these activities. So for me, it all started with the question, can I use Emacs for most of the stuff? And at that time, I started experimenting with different plugins. I used Enzyme for some time. I used some other plugins for other languages for front-end development, but it didn't stick to me. I kept returning to IntelliJ IDEA and some other IDEs for other languages, and but still I kept using Emacs for note-taking, organizing things. I was using and I keep using it for org mode, which is really awesome. And when I heard about LSP, I understood this is exactly what I was looking for. So one thing I want to mention, it's not ideal, and I don't want to pretend it's ideal, and I will not hide it from you. Rather than that, I will share what doesn't work for me and what workarounds I do. But the general strategy is what doesn't work for me with LSP, I can always do with Emacs one way or another. So these days I do a big data development for one of our clients at Microsoft, and I would say 40% of the time I spend working with a Scala and Spark codebase. The rest 60% I spend working with various ETLs in Python and even in JavaScript. I do a little bit of a front-end development, some of the DevOps activities, a fair amount of bash scripting, working with Docker, sometimes even maintaining PHP code, and yeah, maybe something that I even forgot about. So why should you care? And let's get a little bit more, let's bring a little bit of a problem context here. So various cases that you might imagine or even recall, maybe even feel right now. So one is you have recently switched to a new project, or you are involved in new activities on an existing project, and often this involves using different language, which brings different tooling, different IDE, and inherently different workflow. And usually it's a big mental switch. So from my own experience, what I remember switching to some other IDE just to write code in another language, first thing I was doing mentally, I was looking for the same kind of k-bindings, the same kind of features that I used to. So this is kind of a mental overhead. Another case, this is what's probably close to my current state of things on what I'm currently doing. You have a really various, really versatile code base of different languages, and what you usually do is you keep around, you keep firing up and shutting down different IDEs in order to not blow up your hardware. And again, it's switching, mental switch. And the third case can be you just want to learn new language, you want to become a data scientist, for instance, and probably you will need to install a lot of Python tooling or R language tooling. And it's again, you will spend time, rather than learning, you will spend time learning tools. So by the time you can notice that a lot of languages, most of the languages have a lot in common. The same goes with editors. So what language server protocol does is basically it provides a layer of abstraction, a common protocol between a language and editor. And this simple idea seems to me really genius. Like when I first heard about it, I thought, why nobody was thinking about that before. So again, this is just a protocol. This is a specification. It doesn't provide the features itself. So it's a matter of text editors and language servers, so-called language servers, to implement that protocol. And once implemented, what you get with LSP is that you can choose your favorite editor and forget about switching to some other editor. You can work with different code, different languages the same way. And I don't want to concentrate on LSP or go through architecture of it or internals. There will be probably other talks dedicated to it. But what I want to mention is that language server protocol is JSON-based protocol, and there are kind of two sides of things, server and client. And in this sense, our editor is a client, and language server is basically a server. So let's bring Emacs in the equation. And so LSP support in Emacs works through package LSP mode. It's like a plugin. I will use word package because it's a terminology used by Emacs. So we can just look at the supported languages, and it's, I guess all of the popular languages are supported right now, and even something like XML, YAML, to CMake and Bash, all of these languages are handled the same way through LSP mode. So Metals is basically an implementation of the language server protocol. It is a language server. I don't want to go deep into Metals because like one reason is I don't know how it works internally, and there will be other talks dedicated to it. So maybe one thing to mention here that I didn't mention yet is there is actually a third party called build server protocol. It's not only about your language client, your editor, and language server. There is actually a layer of abstraction over your build tools, which basically makes sense the same way as abstracting over the different languages and different editors, because they share a lot in common as well. So basically, Metals is in between. This is basically an implementation of the LSP support for the Scala language. So other languages will have other implementations. So let's switch to more practical side of things. And in order to set up LSP and Metals, basically Scala support in Emacs, you need to do basically two things. It might be more like out of the box for VS Code probably, because this is like a natively supported editor for LSP. But for Emacs, you need to do two things. You need to put Metals binary somewhere on your path on your system, and probably optionally you would configure SBT and Bloop server. Bloop, by the way, this is basically an implementation of this build server protocol. We will take a look at it a little later. So, and the second thing is to install required packages in an Emacs itself. And LSP support in Emacs is basically a group of packages for LSP, like core package LSP mode, LSP UI for various UI features, display kind of front-end features, and a few other packages which basically not just bring up functionality into Emacs, but rather integrate with existing Emacs, either native packages or other packages, popular packages from Emacs ecosystem. So let's take a quick look. I will maybe go through a few things that worth paying attention in the Metals documentation. So first of all, this is not going to be like, as I said, out of the box. At least for Emacs. So what you should do, you should read documentation anyway. And it's enough documentation on the Metals website. And in order to understand how things work together internally, I would say it's really required to go through it. So for Emacs, to install Metals binary, this is what should be done first. It is installed using Corsair. I don't know why it is done so. I would say it would be better just to use some Debian or RPM packages. It would be easier to maintain and update. So in this case, what I do, usually I keep a copy of this command with some customizations in a separate script on my system. And when I want to switch a newer version of Metals to update, I just change the version and other parameters. So other parameters may involve Java heap, for instance, Java heap parameters, or some language server parameters, which you can, by the way, found. It's not very intuitive, but it is under contributing, integrating in new editor. So you can find all the parameters. You may need to change some of those through the time. Yeah. So I will probably walk you through my LSP configuration in Emacs a little later, but this is basically a most important part of LSP support in Emacs, divided in different packages. All right, so let's move to usage. So the first kind of the basic and the most simplest feature, I would say, is hovering. So here I switch to Emacs, I'll switch to full screen. And so this basic feature, first of all, it provides us with some of the kind of a context, like we can see where the variable is used. And another thing, it provides us some sideline context. So this is like the context over some outside context of the function or variable being used. And in the top, you can see this is what provided by LSP UI. Basically, all these features, like visual features, are provided by a separate package, and you can enable or disable them. So just for this presentation, I enabled most of them, but I don't really have them enabled on a daily basis. Sometimes the documentation is so big that it will occupy the whole screen, and I don't want to see it all the time. So, but it is really, really responsive. So while working through a new code base or just some libraries that you are not really familiar with, it's really, really useful to have this documentation right there. And what I wanted to show you that it works the same way for other things for which LSP, for which language server is enabled. So for instance, for Dockerfile, this I find really, really useful. And same goes with Bash script, for instance. So Bash scripting was always hard for me, and this basically probably Bash server is disabled right now. Let me. All right, so yeah, so this makes my life easier with Bash scripts, obviously. And so this was about highlighting and showing documentation. And you can the highlights of kind of a diagnostic information sometimes, for instance, syntactic checks and some compilation errors are displayed as well. So if I make a mistake, yeah, so it shows me the same at the same place on the sideline. This is called LSP sideline, I guess. So this shows me the information flow from a loop compiler, which is basically, as I said, implementation of build server protocol, and at the same time, it is a compiler server which is used by Metals, and Metals keeps this compiler server around while you are working on with the project code base. Yeah, so this goes for diagnostics. An important thing is that this is the way LSP works. It works not LSP but Metals. This works only when you save the file. So only after file save, it will recompile the file. So I really never liked the autosave features in different IDEs. So for me, it's even better, I would say. Okay, so when it comes to code navigation, the most important feature probably that all of us use is navigating the code. And I would say there are two kinds of navigations. One is local, when we go to some method within our project, and the other is when we go to the some external API, some external library. So it works the same way. This is basically called definition on point in terms of LSP. Other things regarding code navigation involves searching for references, implementations, and workspace symbol. So for this, there is a component of LSP UI called LSP UI peak, which, for instance, I want to find the usages references of this function. So I have basically two options. One is just a core LSP mode option of showing me the references in a separate buffer, just a list of references. Another is LSP UI feature, which is basically, which will show me like a floating window, interactive window, like on top of my main window. So this is on the right side, we have a list of references. On the left, it's a kind of a context, the place in code. Yeah, same goes with implementations. And as for workspace symbol, again, we can use LSP UI peak to find some. Yeah, okay, so this time, as I said, not everything works always. So this feature I don't really use a lot. What I really use instead of it is something provided by the plugin called Projectile from Emacs. I will go through it later when I will go through features, specific features of Emacs. So, and for this presentation, by the way, I installed latest versions of packages, of LSP packages, which are not stable, but they include some newer features. So there is another thing on package management I will go through. So free views, there are kind of two kinds of views available. One is something Emacs native called iMenu, which is basically showing a code structure on the right side. And again, it works. I'm showing you all this stuff for Scala, but it actually works for other things as well. For instance, okay, so another kind of view available is Emacs, and Emacs is basically a plugin from Emacs ecosystem, and LSP provides an integration with this. This is basically support for the project review that everybody is used to. I don't use it much because it just occupies a lot of space on the screen. What I used to use through time is just navigating through the open buffers using Emacs native features. But sometimes I use it just to review my package structure and create file or directory. It's easier from here. And LSP provides this use of kind of internal code structure for the Scala files. And more than that, there are a couple of tree views, additional tree views, like errors list, for instance, just showing all the errors in the project. So again, as you see, for some reason, this displays me 2 instances of my project. This is the feature that I don't use much as well, so I didn't spend time configuring or fixing it. But it is there, and what I used to look at is basically SBT compilation output. So yeah, and there are other kind of tree views. I will not go through. Don't have much time for that. What else? Code check. So code check is enabled through the native, not native, but again, one more plugin from Emacs ecosystem called fly check. So for instance, if I made some error somewhere, I can navigate through this like that. So I can display a list of all these syntax compilation problems. And as for completion, there are 2 kinds of completions. One is regular completion for just a context completion called context code completion, and it is provided by the company plugin. And another is is a snippet completion, and snippet is basically when I want, for instance, define a case class, I can just type 2 times C, and yeah, and that's it. So most of the bulk boilerplate can be handled, like class creation, trait creation can be handled with the snippet support. So for code actions, there are just 2 actions that I'm aware of and I use sometimes. It's rename and import. And so code action support is in progress within LSP itself and metals. And as for run test, debug, and SBT, there is really useful thing called lens. Let me show you. Okay, so it will probably be available if my compilation is fixed. Yeah, so this, yeah, probably I have a compilation problem somewhere. But basically what I get, if my project compile, I have a button here to run and to debug. And if it's a test, a Scala test code, for instance, I can run a test within Emacs as well. So this support brought up by the DEP package. So as for carrots and kind of tips and tricks, so first of all, navigation doesn't always work for me, especially when I change something in SBT configuration. Bloop compiler probably has a problem with that to handle. Sometimes it can have a problem to handle that update. And so what I usually do, I keep, and I found it really useful strategy to keep a copy of libraries that I use the most. For instance, Spark. I just keep a copy of check it out copy of source code of Spark, and I navigate through it using Emacs native features with searching some file by name and stuff like that. So usually I use LSP navigation for some quick navigation, and if I need to dig deeper into a code base, I usually use I go to the separate project basically. Yeah, and if there is a problem, sometimes LSP just stops working. What is the first thing I look at is LSP log, and this is information, basically a log of actions in LSP, and if there is something wrong, I will see it. Then I can just restart the session. It's really quickly, and if the problem is related to SBT, probably I need to re-import the build, and for that reason, the good strategy is to keep SBT session open and just run bloop install. Otherwise, it will be you can re-import from within Emacs and from within LSP mode and metals, but it usually takes more time than keeping SBT session, much more time. So this is something I already mentioned. So yeah, for completion. And for Scala SBT, what I didn't mention yet is that there is a nice SBT support in Emacs itself through SBT mode. So you can run SBT session in Emacs, but historically I used to have this in my terminal, and this plugin comes with interactive with this interactive UI. By the way, it's called Hydra, and we will go through it in a moment. And as for LSP, as I mentioned, it's LSP and Metals is under active development, and sometimes if you install the latest version of package, it will not work stable. So recently I decided to use stable versions. It doesn't contain all of the features, but it's much more stable experience. Metal server parameters already mentioned, so sometimes you need to configure them. And so usually if I spend the whole day working with code, I have probably like up to 10 language servers running for different languages. And sometimes it's still not that much of the memory consumption, but it's a lot of memory consumption. So then I need to go and explicitly stop the server, and I can do so through the, let me stop it. Yeah. I can do so through the UI called LSP session UI. And this is a list of my projects and build server, language servers enabled for those projects. For instance, here I have Metals, a language server for Metals, Docker, and Bash. So yeah, sometimes you need to open the project and just stop the language server if you don't need it anymore. And if the project has a lot of files, then there is one more thing related to file watchers. You need to configure it will pay attention to your git ignore and will not index files, for instance, in a target folder. But sometimes the code base can be really big. Okay, so the last part is Emacs tips, Emacs native tips for those probably more familiar with Emacs, and for those who are not, just to inspire you. So first thing I want to say is that vanilla Emacs is really too raw to be used out of the box. So you anyway you need to learn how to configure it and learn a little Emacs Lisp anyway. So first thing, and probably the biggest game changer for me, is using eval package everywhere. So what eval stands for? Well, it's not stands for. It just what eval is the package in Emacs which enables Vim bindings in Emacs itself. So basically, it combines Emacs and Vim together. So it is funny, but Emacs, given all this versatility, has really uncomfortable text editing experience, I would say. So I use Vim, this basic HJKL bindings everywhere. You can see what I'm typing here on the side, by the way. For code navigation, even in a mini buffer, I use Vim bindings. So there is a group of packages to bring in to bring up this eval support into Emacs. The second thing, the second big thing is using space as a dispatcher key using eval leader package. So my space button is really important on my system. So I use i3 window manager, and I switch between workspace using space plus number of workspace, and in Emacs, space acts like a dispatcher key for me, which leads to other groups of different bindings. For instance, for LSP, space L. So I type one key at a time rather than typing key combination like with a native Emacs strategy. And what is the next thing is a Hydra. So when I type space, I have a list of bindings here, and most of it are bound to different Hydras. For instance, the LSP is bound to Hydra LSP, and Hydra is a package, Emacs package, which brings this feature, this ability to define this nice interactive binding views. So through the time, I tried different strategies with bindings in Emacs, and what I learned is that you really need to spend the time to build in your own bindings, and this worked the best. So for instance, for LSP, I probably use 20% of it, but I'm currently experimenting and put a lot of other bindings. I will see if they stick around, and if they're not, I will remove it from this UI. But this is really nice and interactive. So there are some other Hydras for other plugins as well. So almost everything starts for me from the space key. And the auto-completion support that you saw when I was switching projects, for instance. So this is brought in by the plugin called Ivy, and Ivy is basically three things. It's auto-completion support in mini buffer when I'm typing different stuff to interacting with Emacs itself, searching through the text files or running some command or something like that. Then it brings support for searching through the file. This is something I really use a lot. So it is interactive way going through the search candidates. and it overrides some of the native bindings and some of the bindings provided by the third-party packages like projectile, for instance. Projectile is the next big thing that I use in Emacs for project management. It doesn't have kind of a UI or something like that, but it has all of the features that I need to manage projects, and I have Hydra for it. Binding that I usually use is just switching to project that I showed you, switching to file in the project, and so I just can type the file name and just fuzzy search through the files in the project. And there is much more than that. Yeah, one more really useful feature that I use a lot is grabbing through the project code base. For instance, in the Spark code base, what I usually do is I just use a projectile grab feature. So swiper and console, which is are components of Ivy basically. Emacs, I use it sometimes to review basically my package structure. And Magit, this is really awesome. This is, believe me, this is the best Git client ever that I use. So Magit has, it's a package, Emacs package, and it has kind of a dashboard that I just opened with simple Hydra defined for Magit. And so from this dashboard, any kind of action that I need to do with Git is just two keystrokes far from me. So basically, if I need to commit, I just type in 2 times C. So it opens for me interactive UIs for all kinds of actions, and it has support for GitHub. So usual workflow is committing things, pushing them to origin, and creating a pull request, and all this stuff is made in a 6 bindings. Just type in a commit message as well. There is something called Time Machine, which is really nice as well. So it changes the mode of this buffer that I can basically go through the history of the changes. Well, there was not that much changes in this, maybe this one. Yeah, so I can basically scroll through the commit history and see the changes right there on my screen. Yeah, there was not that much changes in this file as well, but you can see commits in the bottom. Fly check is basically the handled again by the Hydra that I showed you. There is a Hydra for fly check, and I just using Vim k-bindings again. I just can go back and forth between errors in my source file. Okay, so how much time you are actually out of time already, probably? So this is something minor on completion. We'll probably not go through that. And some other additional useful things in Emacs, I quickly go through. So super save makes my buffers, my Emacs buffers, to save when I'm leaving my Emacs window. So this is useful when I'm switching to SVT to compile my project. I don't need to save the file because this is how Metals and LSP works with files. You need to save it explicitly. Org mode worth, I guess, separate conference, not just separate doc. But what I wanted to mention is that this presentation itself was generated from simple org mode file using aux reveal. And so yeah, the doom line, this is something you see in the bottom of my screen. This provides enough information for me, just quickly looking at it and seeing what is the status. This is a flight check status, the status code check. This is probably if you get used to use mouse, because I don't use mouse much, I do everything from the keyboard, most of the things, and interaction with LSP and DEP as well. The icons that you have seen in some places brought by all the icons package. And as for package management and for the package management, I use package macro for Emacs almost everywhere. So some of the older stuff that I added to my Emacs configuration was not using this use package, but these days I always use this plugin. So, and this is my Emacs configuration file. It's a little bit more than 2,000 lines long. It's really a lot, you may say, but I would say half of it occupied by the org mode configurations, and org mode is a separate thing that I use. And the rest 25% probably occupied by the hydras that I defined for the bindings. Yeah, so this is, for instance, hydra for LSP. This is a list of K bindings I'm adding. And yeah, and the rest of it is just different packages. So as I said, you still need to learn a little bit Lisp and Emacs Lisp. And through the time, you will get comfortable with this. And I would say it's worth investing your time into that. So to conclude, what you can do next, you can get metals. You can try metals and LSP going to the Scala Meta website. You can try Emacs, start your journey with Emacs. You can get my configuration from here. This is all that I showed. This is exactly the same configuration available on my GitHub. So I hope you liked it. Thank you for listening, and see ya.
Hello, Yurii.
Yeah.
One small question. Thank you for presentation. It's awesome. One question: how you compare two different files, as example, from local history or from previous commit?
So again, when I'm so this is the Magit kind of dashboard. Let me open it full screen. So what I usually do, for instance, if I need to compare, okay, let me switch to some project with some more meaningful stuff. I will go to Git history, and for instance, if I need to compare, I need to compare two different commits, compare my current branch with master. So this is what was the question, or you asked for different files, just files?
No, same file as example.
Same file?
Yeah.
You're asking about local history, right?
Local or commits.
Well, as for commits, this is what you can do. If the local history, that you can do anything in Emacs, you know. So I don't have actually any setup for the local history in particular. Maybe I don't know about the support in the native Emacs support for local history for scrolling the history itself or something like that. But what's enough for me is just committing regularly, and then I can compare files the regular way. And so I can go to the Magit history view, and yeah, so then I can diff range. So I typed D and R, and then I basically doing something like head and master. And here I have the the comparison. I can group it like that, and I can, while doing this diff, let me open it here, D, then I can do limit to files. I can limit the difference to the current file, or I can even start Magit session in the file itself. Yeah, there is just a quick shortcut to it. There are multiple ways. So Magit is really, really awesome.
Okay, thanks.
I'm actually also a user of the Emacs and Metals. What the size of project do you have? Because I have once a big project with maybe 20 submodules, and Metals is not so good as I expected on the big projects. What's your opinion?
So thanks for your question. Really good question. I didn't try Metals at the big project, like developing on a big project. But what I regularly do is scrolling through the Spark codebase, which is basically a really big project, I guess. But I don't use Metals in a Spark while navigating through this codebase. And what I used to use is just basic projectile find and IV functionality. So I don't really know how the LSP would work on the. Well, I ran it once when I started basically starting to looking at Spark codebase. I probably started from just running LSP server against it, but yeah, it was a little bit lagging, but I can't really remember. So project sizes that I worked with are not that big, and if they would be big, then probably I would stick more to the Emacs native features, which I really got used to, and this can be quite enough for me even without LSP, I would say. But LSP, of course, for Scala itself, this is changing a lot of. This is a game changing.
Okay, thanks.
You did a great job. You know, I've been using Emacs for more than 35 years, and there were a whole bunch of things you showed me that I haven't seen before. And I'm actually emailing Richard Stallman. I've known him for just as long, and I'm going to say this is the coolest thing I've seen in a long time.
Oh
so
my God!
you.
Thank you. This is a pleasure to hear.
You're a real master.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm too new to LSP to really ask a question. I'm just excited that it exists. I'm happy that it exists.
Me too. Yeah, this actually made my life much easier. So when I started with Emacs, my idea was to use it for all of my software development. At that time I did a lot of front-end development and as well as backend in Java and in Scala. So I started using different packages available in Emacs ecosystem, but every package required its own learning curve, you know, and the LSP made things so much easier, and this is really, really great.
Yeah, I've started playing with LSP for Scala code and Emacs. I'm not sure if it's working. I keep getting an error saying, like it seems to be working when I visit a Scala buffer, a Scala file, you know, it says, do you want to import this project? And I press I, and it seems to do that. but then I get this error message about a version number requiring a digit, and instead it's getting a quote, and I haven't tracked down where that error is coming from. So that's why I haven't gotten very far. But I know that's probably my problem, not your problem.
Well, it's a problem. I think it's a problem of this a big barrier of adoption. This in Emacs, I think, because in other editors, this is from what I know. In, for instance, in VS Code, this is much easier to set things up. But in Emacs, yeah, you're right. This is like for me, I spent already quite some time with all this setup, but a lot of things, sometimes it just stops working, and either I don't have time to dig into it, or I just don't know what's happened. So I'm still learning Emacs Lisp, still learning how things working together internally. And so this is the biggest problem with adoption of it. It still requires you to understand how it works internally to make things working. So yeah, but
So
I think it has a big
I know
future.
Emacs really well. You know, I've been using Emacs for 30 years. No, 35 years, maybe longer.
That's a lot.
Long time. So I just have to figure out how to do my Scala in Emacs. I use IntelliJ a lot. And what I use Emacs for the most is, you know, Emacs has, I have Emacs functions and macros that will completely transform my Scala code in a very small amount of time compared to what I'd have to do in IntelliJ. So I kind of go back and forth. And I'm just trying to figure out if I can stay in Emacs and not have to go back to IntelliJ for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think when I started with this setup, I kept using IntelliJ for some things like code lookup or some features that are very advanced and in IntelliJ, available in IntelliJ, some Scala specific features. But then I down the road I just figured out how to do all of the stuff in Emacs, maybe using some Emacs native features, not with LSP. But yeah, the setup, I'm still doing the setup, I would say.
So what is your operating system?
It's Linux. It's yeah, just Linux with a minimalistic Windows manager, i3.
Yeah, that, I mean, I have, I'm talking to you on a Mac, but over here, this machine is Linux, and that is using i3. That's Manjaro, which is an ARC version. And then this machine, this is the work computer. This one's Windows. So this is the one that I was having the problem with Emacs LSP, because, and it might be a Windows problem. But yeah, if I can figure out what that error message was, then
you have a lot of computers.
In my house, I think I have 20. They're not all running.
Oh my God.
Well, it's because I'm old, so I don't throw them out.
So you're still using every computer for something?
No. Like up in the attic. Do you remember Sun Microsystems? Okay, I have a color monitor that I bought. It weighs 70 pounds, so it's like 35 kilos, and it used to cost $7,000. I was very happy because I got it on eBay 20 years ago for $700. But that's just sitting in the attic. You know, if we have a bad storm and the house collapses and that falls on my head, I'm going to be dead. No, I have a lot of really old stuff, and then, you know, I buy the local college. They sell their old computers for $10 when they're not using them, and then I buy them and I give them away to people who don't have computers. So, but I usually configure them with Linux before I do that, because the Linux runs on the older computers better than anything else. Yeah, I'm trying to see what happens when I bring up Emacs LSP, what the actual error message is. Anyway, I don't mean to sidetrack this. You can keep talking. I'll try to find the error message.
Yeah, I think it's really great that there are certain things in the computing overall, that in the software systems that keep around for such a long time, like Unix systems, and Emacs and Vim on, I guess, 40 or even more than 40 years.
Well,
around.
Emacs goes back to, well, you know, I've always used the Richard Stallman version of Emacs, and I consider him the author of Emacs. Now, Eric Raymond thinks that he wrote the first Emacs. That's another story. But I actually wrote part of VI, a very, very small part of VI. When I was a freshman in college, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, I need you to write something that when you type a close brace, it will find the matching open brace and flash it. So that was my contribution to VI in the late 1970s, but back when it was AT&T stuff. So now I'm trying to keep my VI knowledge alive, even though I'm an Emacs user. I use the Vim mode in IntelliJ because it works better than the Emacs emulation. If I have Emacs emulation, I want all of Emacs. I don't want like a little piece of Emacs. Whereas Vim mode actually is all of Vim, kind of, most of it.
Do you use Evil in Emacs?
No, because I'm not a VI user who's using Emacs. I think that's what Evil mode is for. Like if I'm in Emacs, I'm going to use Emacs stuff. It's really funny because people say they're really productive in either VI or Emacs. For me, I'm definitely faster in Emacs. But I know people who are the opposite. But then I've been using Emacs for 30 years, so of course I'd be,
For me, it was just physically painful to type all these bindings with a control.
In Emacs.
Holding.
Yeah, I guess I just got used to it. I mean, maybe my biology changed, but I'll tell you a story. So, Richard Stallman wrote Emacs, right? And he, what RSI is? Repetitive stress injury.
Yeah.
In the late 1980s, so sometime around 1980, late 80s, early 90s, I don't remember, he got RSI and he couldn't use Emacs, okay? And so he had people helping him type. And so I learned how he dictates. He would dictate, and for a while I was his typist, and it was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, because he would dictate what he wanted to appear on the screen, including, like, he doesn't say Control X, he says Troll X, So he talks very fast. And if you typed one key combination different than what he said, he would get really angry. And that was very stressful. Luckily, his RSI went away and he's better and he does his own typing now and everything's fine. But even Richard had a problem. But I've actually been lucky. I've never had this problem. Okay.
This is really interesting story. So you actually have so much stories to tell. You have to.
Well, because I'm old. That's what happens. You get older, you pick up stories. Right?
Not everybody has so much really interesting stories with Richard Stallman and.
Well, I've known Richard since the GNU Manifesto. In fact, there's a friend of mine who introduced me to Richard because I had a whole bunch of C code that I didn't know what to do with in the early 1980s. And I was selling it for $400. You send me $400. No, you send me $25 and I'll send you a disk of source code. And because I just wanted to get rid of it. I didn't want to throw it out. And then so Richard came out with the GNU Manifesto, and my friend Charles said, "Hey, have you read that?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I know Richard, I can introduce you." So he introduced me to Richard, and that's how we became friends, because I gave Richard all my code. And I'm Richard's pilot, for example. If he wants to fly somewhere and the airlines won't take him, he'll ask me if I'll fly him. which only works if it's somewhere close to my house. The other funny thing is, it turns out Richard and I grew up like half a block away from each other in New York City way back when, because one day I visited his mother with him, and then the same day we visited my mother, and that's how we found out that we live so close. Even though he's 7 years older than I am, so we wouldn't have run into each other otherwise. But anyway, so my friend Charles introduced me to Richard, and then a few years later, Charles asked me if I could introduce him to Richard. And I said, Charles, you're the one who introduced me to Richard. And he's like, oh yeah, that's right. So then I introduced him to Richard. And what really irritates my friend Charles is every time Richard sees him, he says, oh yeah, you're Jeff's friend. But, you know, I mean, that's because I see Richard all the time, you know. So. In fact, he sent me an email today. He's working on another thing to send out to the world, and he's asking for commentary, you know, for suggestions on edits. So anyway, let me see if I can bring up, I'm trying to duplicate this error that I get. Okay, there we go. So I go into the file in Emacs, and file mode specification error, error invalid version number, and then the message went away, but I can get it back. I mean, Metals is starting up, and there's a Metal standard error buffer too. So it's like almost working for me.
It might be related to Scala version, if it's
212 something.
No, it should be fine.
Yeah. Well, that so now I accidentally typed a key. Now Windows is like frozen because it's Windows. Anyway, when it comes back, I'll figure it out.
Thank you, guys.